you're a serious collector, this book should be on your radar. Find out why Suspense Comics number 3 is the most valuable non-superhero book in the hobby. In 2017, Heritage Auctions sold a 9.2, that's a near mint minus copy, for over $250,000. That was the most money ever spent for a non-superhero comic book. Hi, I'm Keston. I'm excited to talk about my favorite book of all time, Suspense Comics number 3. We're going to explore that over-the-top cover, look into the book's history, and also examine its scarcity. This is a notoriously hard book to find. Oh yeah, and one more thing. I'm going to share some tips with you that even most Golden Age dealers don't know about this book. The cover. The first thing people often notice is the character in the middle. He's the first of 10 evil dudes who are on the scene. Next, the eye goes to the damsel in distress. She's tied up and it doesn't look too good for her. Last, if you look really closely, you can see the hero in the corner. It's funny how the hero is the last thing you see. I've got a question for him. What's your strategy? You seem terribly overmatched.
Ooh.
Let me share some advice that I learned from my parents. Never bring a spear to a Tommy gun fight. Is there anything else that you would like to say? Please give this video a like and pray for me. When some people see this cover, they assume that it's pro-Nazi. That couldn't be further from the truth. The book was published by Continental in April of 1944. The U.S. was in the throes of World War II. Many publishers supported the war effort via propaganda. Americans and their allies were portrayed as being smart, handsome, courageous. On the other hand, our enemies at the time, the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, weren't treated kindly by the writers or the illustrators. Suspense Comics number 3 is a perfect example. Alex Schomburg, the artist, made the Germans look as evil as possible by crossing Nazis and the KKK. In fact, this cover is so striking that it's often considered to be a horror book. The cover artist, Alex Schomburg, deserves elaboration. He was one of the most prolific artists in the 1940s. In fact, by some estimates, he illustrated over 600 covers. His first was with Timely. Timely would later become Marvel. There, he met a young man at the time, Stan Lee. And here's what Stan Lee had to say about Alex Schomburg. Suspense 3 wasn't Schomburg's only hit. Far from it. Today, CGC and Overstreet recognize dozens of his covers as being classic. Nevertheless, his style changed dramatically from 1940 to 1949. In 1940, his style might be called pulpy. Perhaps not a surprise because in the previous decade, in the 1930s, he was an illustrator for many pulp magazines. As we move into the mid part of the 1940s, Schomburg began to focus on World War II covers. They were incredibly busy. He packed so much action into every single cover. And there were many, many Nazis featured, many of them wearing masks. At the end of the decade, he began doing airbrush covers, and some of those covers are among the most beautiful of all the Golden Age. Even among these classic covers, Suspense 3 stands out. In fact, Intelligent Collector magazine put out a list of the top 20 Golden Age covers. Among this exclusive list, Suspense 3 finished number 2. Despite being a classic cover among classic covers, Suspense 3 wasn't always well known. In fact, it was considered obscure through the 1980s. But that changed in 1989 with the publication of this book, The Photojournal Guide to Comic Books, Volume 1. It was compiled by Ernst and Mary Gerber. Let's take a look at it. I opened up the cover, nothing there, but then one page in, there you go. This is the title page to the book, and it's got Suspense 3 in the background. Now, why is that important? Up to this point, there was not a comprehensive guide to the photos of Silver and Golden Age books. The Gerbers took on the Herculean task of trying to hunt down every single book they could find, take a picture of it, and put it in these volumes. It was just an amazing, amazing contribution to the collecting of comic books. The comic book community embraced the photo guide, and thousands of people saw that huge picture of Suspense Comics number 3. The obscure book wasn't so obscure anymore. In addition, the Gerbers provided something called the Scarcity Index, which ranged from 1 to 11. The higher the number, the scarcer the book. And they gave every single book in the photojournal a scarcity number. They assigned Suspense Comics number 3 a 9, which meant that they believed only 6 to 10 copies existed. For comparison, they listed Action Comics #1 as a 7 on the Scarcity Index, believing that 21 to 50 copies of Action 1 existed. So in one fell swoop, the photojournal showcased this book, Suspense 3, giving it a lot more attention and at the same time pointing out how rare this book is. Let me point out the obvious. The photojournal came out in 1989, and I'm sure the Gerbers did the best job they could about estimating how many copies of a particular book might exist, but they were at a huge disadvantage compared to today. With the internet and tools like CGC Census, we have a lot better information to draw from. CGC is the largest third-party grader of comic books. For every book they grade, they log it into their census. The census, of course, isn't perfect, but it does give us a good sense of the relative prevalence of particular books. I'm going to show you what the census looks like for Suspense Comics 3 compared to Action Comics #1, the first Superman, and just for fun, we'll add in a Silver Age book, Amazing Fantasy 15, which is the first appearance of Spider-Man. Let's go through the numbers. Suspense Comics 3, 39 copies. Action Comics #1, 73 copies. Amazing Fantasy 15, almost 3,500 copies. Let me break that down another way. For every 1 copy of Suspense 3, we have almost 2 copies of Action 1 and nearly 100 copies of Amazing Fantasy 15. Now that number 39 is still a lot more than the estimated 6 to 10 copies that Gerber gave back in 1989. Nevertheless, I think we can all agree that Suspense 3 is still a really tough book to find. In just a moment, I'm going to share the insider tips and knowledge for the advanced collector who might be interested in obtaining a copy of Suspense 3. But let me first briefly summarize why Suspense 3 is so valuable. When all the characteristics are laid out, it starts making sense why Suspense 3 can fetch 6 figures. It's a world-class cover, one of the best of the Golden Age, done by the best cover artist of the period. It's World War II themed, and it's also relatively well known among series collectors. And finally, it's extremely rare, even among Golden Age books. So you're a series collector and you're thinking about getting a copy of Suspense 3 for yourself. I've got 5 pieces of information for you. The first is be patient. There are only a few dozen of these books around, so buying and selling is infrequent. For example, I've been looking out for Suspense 3 copies for about the last 10 years, and I've seen approximately 10 copies during that time. So give or take a little bit, a copy comes up for sale about once per year. The second piece of information is a fun fact. The book only has one staple. One staple, why is that, you might ask? Well, remember when it was published? It's 1944. We're in the middle of World War II, and resources are scarce. So many publishers were only using one staple to save on the metal. Third, a mid-grade copy should be considered exceptionally nice. To my knowledge, there are only 8 books total that are graded at 5.0 or higher. 6 are on the CGC census and 2 on CBCS. And part of that reason is because so many of the books are missing centerfolds. Recall, the book only had one staple to hold together the whole book. So oftentimes that staple would fail and the centerfold would come out. A book without a centerfold is definitely not worth as much as a book that's fully intact. Fourth, let's take a look at that upper right-hand corner. It doesn't look so pretty. In fact, if you were to lay out all the copies of Suspense 3, you see that many of them have that problem with the upper right-hand corner. Fortunately, CGC doesn't nail the grade too hard for these books. The reason being is it's thought to be a manufacturing defect as opposed to human wear and tear. And last, if you're carefully looking at the book, you'll notice something on the cover that doesn't look quite right. It's that space between the hero and the sword. Some people would think it looks like an erasure and they'll ask, was there some kind of problem with that cover? But if you look at all the covers of Suspense 3, they all look the same way. So that wider spot was actually intentional by the artist Schomburg. Perhaps it was a reflection of the moon. It doesn't quite make sense to me, but that's not an error. That's the way the book is supposed to look. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. It was a thrill to talk about my favorite book, Suspense Comics #3. If you like this content, please hit that like button or perhaps even subscribe. I hope to see you around real soon.